All right, this is a very special episode. I'm going solo. Well, kind of solo. My wife Amanda is with me.
Hi, guys.
And, you know, it's Epilepsy Awareness Month and Infantile Awareness Week, the first week of December. And for the OG group chat listeners, I've described our son Mavericks' journey in pretty detail. He was diagnosed with a very rare form of epilepsy called infantile spasms at the age of 6 months. He's now 5. He has had 3 brain surgeries, which we're going to talk about. And today's very special because his neurologist, Dr. Shaun Hussain at UCLA, who by all accounts for this condition, infantile spasms, is the number 1 guy in the world that we were lucky enough to get to at the age of 6 months, right when he was diagnosed. And he gives a master class on the brain, epilepsy, infantile spasms, and the challenges and resources required to help solve this problem, help children, and help kids, have a better life that are diagnosed with, these rare conditions. Amanda, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think most importantly, I think that the research is just so very needed. He also talks about that we're extremely lucky. I know we've said this on Instagram before, but we just happen to be 2 miles away from like the guy who we've triple and quadruple checked across Instagram, across friends, across our most like trusted friends who are brilliant doctors. Like this is the guy who kind of like is definitely leading the charge. And we couldn't be more grateful that he's here, because if not, we would be wherever he is, to be honest. Like we would have moved. So he has a lot of important things to say. I think he really delves into it pretty deeply, but also we're doing this because of Infantile Spasms Month and in hopes to get the Cathys and then also our friends, obviously, and family to kind of, because 'tis the season, to kind of raise some money for some research for his condition.
So for context, we've personally donated a significant amount of money to UCLA. And a lot of our friends have, which we're very thankful for. So 4 years ago, we did a GoFundMe, and the group chat Cathys all came and, did an exceptional job. We raised $50,000 just through an Instagram link and a podcast link. And Amanda and I have donated significantly more than that to UCLA over the last couple of years. A lot of our friends have been generous enough to donate significant amount, and we're
incredibly grateful, but we also want to pick it up this year since 'tis the season. So if anyone is really inspired by Mav's story, or knows someone with epilepsy, or is connected to,
and even if you can't donate, because I know and not everyone has the means, you
absolutely
just
true.
Spread the awareness.
Yeah,
share this podcast, get people informed. We're not trying to tax people, but people who do have the resources that are looking for things in the holiday season to donate towards, this is a fantastic cause that goes directly to the doctor you're about to listen to and all his research that has directly affected our family. And what's the GoFundMe link, Amanda?
It is gofundme.com/UCLA Infantile Spasms.
So it's UCLA Infantile INFANTILE Spasms SPASMS.com.
Correct. Yes. And we'll obviously be linking it on both mine and Anand's profiles. We're going to put
and the group chat Instagram. We'll be posting it. It'll be on YouTube. It'll be everywhere.
And if you can't find it, just ask. We'll send you the link.
And
direct.
More importantly, this interview is incredible. It's very meaningful to us, and it's very informative, because this is a topic that most people don't understand, and the brain is very tough to figure out. So separate from donating,
which is very admittedly by most doctors, is the brain is kind of the hardest organ that no one understands. I think it's, 10% of it, whereas the rest of them we kind of got. So this one needs a lot of work.
Yeah. So hope you enjoy the interview, and Dr. Hussain is coming up. Thank you. All right, Dr. Hussain, thanks so much for your time and coming here today to educate our audience on all things epilepsy, infantile spasms. So just to kind of get into it, all HIPAA released, let's talk about Mavericks Journey. So he was your patient starting at 6 months. And if you could just kind of walk through how he came in as a patient and where he is now and all the things we've done in the last 4.5 years.
Sure. Yeah. So first, it's my pleasure to be with you. Eager to do anything I can to boost public awareness of epilepsy and in particular infantile spasms. I'm guessing a lot of your listeners have never heard of infantile spasms, just like the rest of the world. So we have a big challenge ahead of us. But Maverick's journey is he's having a tough go of it. He was doing great before infantile spasms. He got the spasms as an infant and went through a lot of typical treatments. But the first thing to say is that infantile spasms are a type of seizure. And when you continue to have seizures without any provocation, like without a fever or an infection of the brain or alcohol exposure, that's what we call epilepsy. So epilepsy just means unprovoked seizures, and infantile spasms are a form of epilepsy. So he began having those seizures as an infant, and we really struggled to keep them under control. He had some temporary response to common treatments like prednisolone, which is a drug we use for all sorts of things. It's an anti-inflammatory drug that we use for things like poison ivy or for allergies. But it's also used for other inflammatory disorders, and we think that many forms of epilepsy, including infantile spasms, are an inflammatory disorder. But that therapy and a similar therapy called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, both of those never led us to an enduring response or lack of seizures.
Those are both steroids.
Well, technically, prednisolone is a steroid. ACTH is also a hormone that drives the production of cortisol, which is a steroid that's almost identical to prednisolone. So it's fair to think of them as steroid-like drugs. And these steroids are different than the steroids that athletes abuse. They're not performance enhancing. These are powerful anti-inflammatory drugs. They do lots of things in the body, include regulate blood pressure, a lot of downstream effects, and they're dangerous. These drugs suppress the immune system. We think there's about an approximate 1 in 500 risk of death with these therapies because you suppress the immune system so badly that little infections like the common cold can become a severe infection like a severe pneumonia or meningitis, and those can be lethal. And we, on rare occasions, see that. And that really speaks to the danger of infantile spasms. Infantile spasms don't look anything like other forms of epilepsy. Most people, when they hear the word seizure or epilepsy, they imagine an adult who falls to the ground, is violently shaking, frothing at the mouth. Infantile spasms are completely different from that. And that is a big reason why we're here today, to just to educate people about infantile spasms. And the problem is that when parents see their kid have their first infantile spasms, they don't know what it is. They usually know something's wrong. They see their child having a cluster of events. And each event typically looks like just a 1 or 2 second daze out where the kid is no longer making eye contact, may raise their shoulders or arms kind of violently for not more than a second, and then comes back to normal. And then everything seems to be okay for 5 or 10 seconds, and then it happens again. Everything's okay for another 5 or 10 seconds, happens again. And that process repeats for several minutes. And people see something like that, and they have no idea what it is. Most parents, when I ask them in retrospect, their gut instinct was that something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was. And when they asked for help or advice, there was continued confusion. Like you ask your parents and they think, oh, you're a first-time parent. You don't know what normal baby movements are. This is fine. Don't worry about it. Or worse, you ask your pediatrician or an emergency room physician, and all too often you get that same response that people don't know what infantile spasms are. And although infantile spasms are a common form of epilepsy in the first year of life, most medical students don't get any exposure to it. If they aren't lucky enough to see a case during medical school, there's a big risk that they won't see it. And if you don't see it, you're much less likely to remember it. And that's where the trouble builds, that we have inadequate awareness not only in the public, but we have inadequate awareness within medical circles. And this causes diagnostic delays. And the problem, the huge problem, is that these seizures look very mild compared to what we think of as seizures. Most people, again, they're thinking about a long convulsion of 30 seconds or several minutes duration, something kind of violent and scary. Those violent and scary seizures are nothing compared to infantile spasms in terms of the potential harm to the patient. So let's talk about that. What happens if you don't get a diagnosis or don't treat this form of epilepsy? The answer is that you're at tremendous risk of lifelong epilepsy, other forms of epilepsy, other seizures. You're at risk for intellectual disability, and you're at risk for autism. And you don't want to take any of those risks. The longer spasms go without diagnosis and effective treatment, the higher the risk of all of those downstream comorbidities or downstream bad events. So that's really what we're after. We need to, number one, educate everyone about epilepsy in general, and especially infantile spasms, so that these diagnoses don't get delayed. And we frankly need to get better treatments. So even in Maverick's case, we kind of figured it out. There wasn't too long of a delay, but we had a heck of a time stopping spasms and keeping them gone. So what else did we do? We talked about prednisolone and ACTH. The other key first-line therapy that we use is a drug called vigabatrin. And vigabatrin is also kind of scary. It doesn't carry a risk of death like prednisolone or ACTH, but it carries some risk of vision loss. So when you read the label on the bottle, it says there is a 1/3 risk of irreversible vision loss. This is probably overstated, but the true risk in infants is not adequately studied. And I think just put yourselves in the shoes of a parent who has just seen these kind of weird events. There's maybe been some delay and disorganization in getting to a diagnosis and getting to a physician who knows what infantile spasms are and can treat them. And then when they finally get that diagnosis, they are told that there is huge risk of intellectual disability, autism, other epilepsy, really, in short, a devastating outcome, and that the treatment they need is prednisolone or ACTH and vigabatrin, both together. It's truly scary, especially because these drugs just don't work that well. The short-term response is about 50% for prednisolone and ACTH. For vigabatrin, it's about 30%. And all told, we're able to cure about 20% of patients. So 20% of patients are truly cured. Their spasms go away. They don't have a relapse. They are normal. And that family is luckier than we know because they get to forget about infantile spasms and go about their day and about their life. And they really escape. But the other 80% are falling victim to relapses of infantile spasms, emergence of other epilepsy, emergence of autism when those kids are 2 to 4 years old, and risk of sudden death, either from epilepsy or from other consequences of having a severe brain illness. And to make it worse, if I haven't appealed to your sensitivities or compassion, let me appeal to your wallet. This care is extremely expensive. So ACTH, for example, costs about $150,000 US per patient, and vigabatrin costs about $50,000 per course per patient. So we're spending a ton of money on medications that are extremely risky and inadequately effective. And then you look at the costs of other direct medical care, like getting hospitalized. When we make this diagnosis, what does it take? You need to tell your story to your doctor. They refer you to a neurologist who maybe refers you to an epilepsy specialist who then says, okay, this sounds like infantile spasms. We need to admit you to the hospital today and run a test called an EEG. And that EEG is basically a test where we glue 20 electrodes to your scalp and we measure and observe brain waves constantly and keep the patient on video. So we record video and brain waves synchronously. And when those spasms strike, typically in the morning, about once a day, we see that cluster, we see the events on the video, we see typical changes on the EEG, and then we say, we've got a diagnosis. And then we start those expensive, risky therapies. And unfortunately, we then send you or your insurance company a bill. And those bills are enormous. This testing is pretty sophisticated. It's not available at all centers. And all told, it's probably in the neighborhood of several $1,000s per night for these evaluations. And when we think about infantile spasms in this epilepsy, you often need to repeat this testing multiple times, either to get the diagnosis or to verify that treatment is working, or to verify that a suspected relapse has happened, or to verify that other seizures are happening. So we are spending a ton of money in the care of this disorder. And then, unfortunately, all of that is nothing compared to the long-term costs of care for patients who don't adequately respond. If you don't respond to therapy, you're looking at needing full support for all of your activities of daily living for the rest of your life. And that is typically $6 to $7 million per patient. And then it still gets worse. What happens to the rest of the family? They don't work as much. They're underemployed. Even if they are employed, they are less productive at work. And then those parents, because they are simply going through hell, they use more medical resources for their own care. So we see that those parents are going to the emergency room more often than other parents, even more often than other parents of children with different chronic diseases. And they are using more mental health resources because they are, as you might imagine, pretty darn stressed. And we think that they are having other consequences of stress, like heart attacks. So these, the consequences here are enormous, and it really behooves us to know about this disorder and to invest our energy to prevent it and to study it. And it's a tragedy that no one has even heard of this. It's literally killing people. We're spending a ton of money. We've got to change the course of this disease and our care of it.
Yeah, no, thanks for the explanation. I think we've obviously been through it, as you know. I think you guys, you and at UCLA did some pretty aggressive treatments in terms of surgery. So separate from all the medications that you described that we tried, it would be helpful if you explain the surgeries Maverick went through.
Yeah. So beyond those first three medications that we talked about, there are a slew of other approaches to try to, frankly, to desperately try to stop these seizures. And that includes, about a dozen other medications, as well as a variety of surgical approaches and dietary approaches. So those surgeries kind of fall into a couple categories. So the first thing we got to say, well, what causes these seizures? And the answer is lots of things, and we don't know. Okay, so among the things that we know that cause infantile spasms, the most common things are brain disorders, including things like inherited genetic disorders, as well as structural abnormalities in the brain. So, for example, if a kid has a stroke, now most people hear the word stroke and they say that's something that happens to old people. That doesn't happen to babies. And unfortunately, that's wrong. There are lots of cases where strokes happen in children or newborns or even in the fetus. So a stroke can happen even before birth. And that situation is, you could see it as good or bad. It's certainly better to have a stroke when you're an infant than when you're an adult, because the brain is very flexible, or what we call plastic. There's plasticity, meaning that if there is injury to the brain as an infant or before birth, there's a lot of capacity for recovery. But despite that capacity for recovery, there is a vulnerability to get things like infantile spasms. So a stroke in infancy is a big cause. The other big structural cause are what we call these malformations of brain development, and in particular, an entity called cortical dysplasia. So you can have these abnormalities in the brain, and if your seizures or infantile spasms are coming from that abnormality, you can quite simply surgically remove that abnormality. And that is a big piece of the care we do at UCLA. So we do a lot of epilepsy surgery to remove pieces of brain that are the source of seizures. And as you can imagine, that's kind of a scary proposition because nobody wants to have any brain removed. But when you're looking at something as scary and dangerous and devastating as infantile spasms, those brain surgeries get far less scary, especially when recovery after brain surgery is exceptional in infants and young children compared to adults. And also in our favor is that a lot of times the parts of the brain that are responsible for seizures aren't doing anything good. They're not fulfilling the tasks or roles that they had been predestined to carry out. So you can have a lot of these surgeries and not have much in the way of consequences of removing these pieces of brain. So we do a lot of homework to try to figure out what parts of the brain need to be removed and what are the projected consequences, if any, of removing those parts of brain. And that is an option for about 10% of patients with infantile spasms, only 10%. And it's actually a great option. If that's your situation and there's just one piece of small brain, one small piece of brain that is responsible for your seizures, you take it out and you've essentially cured the patient because you have physically removed the source of their seizures. Their risk of relapse or other seizures in the future is dramatically reduced, and they're in a really good position to have a great life. Now, there are lots of situations, unfortunately, where it's not so clear, where we suspect one of these abnormalities like cortical dysplasia, but it's hard to see on pictures of the brain. It's hard to see on MRI. And we do our best to characterize the presence or absence. And we do our best to characterize the spatial distribution of these abnormalities in the brain. And sometimes we can't figure it out. We might be in a situation where we suspect it, and we need to do something aggressive to try to refine our evaluation of where those abnormalities lie. And that's unfortunately what happened to Maverick. We saw, we looked at the MRI and said, in this part of the brain, in the back part, we think we see cortical dysplasia, and we think there's a good chance that if we remove it, that the spasms will be gone and we'll be good to go. And, that was not a reassuring characterization. I'm guessing if I remember your reaction to me saying that.
Well, we did do the MEG, which was kind of a pretty good indication.
We can get into that testing. Okay, so let's.
But no,
Sorry.
I think it's actually important to point out the desperation when none of the therapies are working and seizures are still roaring. He's not developing.
And we're 10 medicines deep.
We were just like, go for it. Even though it wasn't, like you said, the most reassuring, prognosis. But, we have enough confidence in you and the team that we were just like, we got to do something different.
Yeah, but also I think the MEG also was like a really big key aspect in
so those tests that we do to figure out where that abnormality is. The first one is just a brain MRI, and that's kind of a standard high resolution picture of the brain. And that helps us look at structure. But more important for seizures often is function. So one of the other tests we did was a magnetoencephalogram, or an MEG. And this is a way of looking at, it's kind of an indirect way of looking at electrical activity in the brain. So when you think about the brain, our individual brain cells communicate with each other through these electrical impulses. You're seeing electricity. And whenever there is an electricity or an electric field, there is an associated magnetic field. So I might be giving some people some high school or college physics PTSD here. But if you remember, for every electrical field, there's a magnetic field. And you can interpret those fields to look for abnormalities of electrical communication in the brain. And that's what MEG does. It helps us find out where seizures are coming from and where electrical abnormalities are happening all the time in infantile spasms, not just during the seizures, but 24/7, can help us localize those things. And that MEG really suggested to us that it was on one side in the back part of the brain. And what was our proposed solution? Well, it was to take out that part of the brain, right? And that's what we did. We did a pretty aggressive resection. And how has it worked? Well, there was some temporary reduction in the burden of seizures. but it wasn't enduring. And seizures came back. And what was tough was that they were extremely subtle at that point. It was not the sort of thing where even a physician who knows about infantile spasms could look at those seizures on video or live and know that they were seizures. They were so subtle. And yet the consequences of those visibly subtle seizures was still there. We weren't getting the developmental improvement that we were after. And that's why we kind of went back to the drawing board and said, okay, we haven't had success so far, but we need to try other medications. And unfortunately, the list of medications that Maverick and many patients try in this desperate situation is a long one. And it includes drugs like felbamate, which is a drug that is, we think, fairly effective for infantile spasms. But again, it's got a side effect profile, and it makes people insomniacs. It reduces their appetite. Some of those kids are losing weight in a way that's not healthy for their brain. And it carries a small risk of death from liver failure. And it's expensive. Along the way, we saw that there was maybe some benefit from that drug. We also reached for another new drug, which is cannabidiol, which is a derivative of marijuana. And, sitting in today's world, it's recognized that this drug is effective for some seizures. Although it's still not clear if it works for infantile spasms. But, several years ago, when we were having those initial conversations, in the years immediately prior to that, the use of cannabidiol was extremely controversial. And the use of CBD or cannabidiol-rich extracts was kind of viewed as illegal, and still today even. Non-pharmaceutical CBD products are viewed as illegal in some spheres, especially when you look at it from a federal standpoint.
For us, that was the easiest drug to put him on. We were like, yeah, just like,
yep.
It's natural. Like, that was simple for us. Just to back up for 1 second, though, his resection did show cortical dysplasia when we biopsied it. So
yeah, it did. So, what we took out, we did see that cortical dysplasia. But
so his tissue was diseased, and it needed to come out.
Correct, but there's probably more cortical dysplasia elsewhere, and we can't see it despite our best technology. And it's hard to go from that point and do more resection without knowing exactly what you're up against.
Yeah. Now we have to just
rely.
Just
kind of set up the drama of how this all happened. I mean, I don't even know if you remember this because you see so many patients. It was the day before the city was locking down. During COVID in March of 2020, and you called me and you were like, hey, I need you in the hospital ASAP. I need to get the data so that he's deemed a critical patient. So if we are going to go down this surgical route, he's going to be allowed to be in the hospital. And that's ultimately what happened. And then we did 2 surgeries before the resection, which is the cutting the left and right side of the brain, to find out that the back right side had dysplasia. And after all that, we still had seizures.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is why we had the resection. But then, like Dr. Hussain mentioned, he did relapse. And so our thought, or his thought, is that there is a smaller section also of cortical dysplasia on his other side of his brain, which there's no other further surgical outcome for that. We have to rely on meds, which we eventually we kept doing different ones. We did another round of steroids. We tried long steroids, and then eventually we were going to look into a third surgery, which was the fourth surgery. Which was electrodes. If you can kind of explain that surgery.
Sure. So there are some cases where you can simply remove a piece of brain and get your desired outcome, seizure freedom and normalization of brainwaves. There are some emerging technologies that help us, though. And the idea of these technologies is to preserve brain in place and not remove it, but maybe modify its function or modify its electrical irritability so that you can stop seizures and quiet those abnormalities. And this comes in several flavors. There are ways to stimulate the brain directly by putting electrodes inside the brain in areas of the brain that are either the source of seizures or are along a pathway that propagates a seizure. Or you can indirectly stimulate the brain by putting an electrode on a nerve in the neck called the vagal nerve. And if you stimulate that nerve in a particular fashion, you can send those impulses up to the brain to kind of suppress those same target areas. And in our desperation, what we were talking about and have so far avoided is something called responsive neurostimulation, or RNS. And it is both a very cool and very scary technology. So let me explain. So what happens? So if you have seizures that are resistant to your available medications, you don't have better options, we basically put these electrodes in the brain where we think the seizures are coming from, and we record brain waves from those implanted electrodes. And then we teach a computer, which is implanted in the skull. So we carve out some space in the skull, about the size of a York peppermint patty. It's about that thick and about that big. And in that little device is a computer and a battery. And we record the EEG with that device. And then every night, what do the parents do? Well, they wave a wand over this device and they upload these brainwave data or EEG data to the cloud. And those are then on the cloud. And then we can analyze those brainwaves that you supply to us. And those are either recorded during seizures or randomly. And we can figure out what a patient's seizures look like on those brainwave recordings, and then devise a strategy to so that when those patterns are recognized, the device sends a pulse of electricity or a series of pulses of electricity to try to stop those seizures or suppress that type of activity. And in general, it actually works. For patients where there's a structural abnormality and a very clear knowledge of where the seizures are coming from, those response rates are in the neighborhood of 50% at 1 year, meaning about half of patients have at least a 50% reduction in seizures. And that when we look year over year, those response rates are actually getting better and better because it actually takes a while to train the device adequately to tackle seizures. And that there seems to be some ongoing benefit. So as you start quieting that misbehaving piece of brain, as you keep doing that month after month and year after year, it gets quieter and it actually behaves better. So we see now that patients who have had
it's sort of like AI learning.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So patients who have had these devices in for the last 10 years, a lot of those responders keep getting better every year. And a lot of them, there are a few who are actually seizure free, but there are quite a few that are nearly seizure free after many years of therapy. And our problem, though, is we just haven't adequately tested this for the treatment of infantile spasms. This device is only about 12 years old, hasn't been approved by the FDA for use in children. So we are kind of going out on a limb in desperation and trying this in other situations, which includes teenagers, kids, and now infants.
So I guess that kind of brings me back to my initial question, sort of like, I know the numbers are all over the place, but I guess my first question is like, how many kids per year in the US are diagnosed with infantile spasms? And then my second question is, can you kind of like, I know it's very fuzzy, but like break down like the percentage of kids that do one round of steroids and they're fine. Not to be dark, but the kids who pass away, and then the kids who are pretty much just don't develop, I guess, for the rest of their lives, or are developing, but like very slowly and get other types of seizures because of it. And I guess kind of the numbers there.
Got it. Okay. So here are the numbers. 1 in 2,500 children will get infantile spasms. And that, some people hear that number and they think it's rare. That's actually a really common number. This is the number one form of epilepsy in the first year of life.
I didn't even know that.
That translates to about 200 new cases every month in the United States.
Oh, okay.
So like 2,400 a year, kind of?
Approximately, yeah.
Yeah.
And so when you use those initial therapies, like prednisolone or ACTH, about 40 to 50% of patients will respond and stay responders up to 3 months after that. But a bunch of them have a relapse. About 20% of them will have a relapse at some point. When you look at vigabatrin, it's about a 30% 25% initial response rate, and again, 20 or 30% relapse. And if you do both of the therapies together, so if you do the two classes, if you do prednisolone and vigabatrin at the same time, that initial response rate is a bit higher. It's more like 60 to 70%. But again, we still see a bunch of relapses afterward. So you've got those relapses. If at that point you've figured out that you're a surgical candidate and you remove that brain, those responses are fantastic. Those response rates are great. They, more like 75% success. And those relapses after successful surgery are very low. In those cases where you think you've got it all and there isn't any remaining brain that can cause seizures, you're in a good situation. But all told, with those initial standard therapies, including surgery, and trying a whole bunch of other medications in desperation, only 15 to 20% of patients are truly cured, meaning that they are developing normally and they're not having seizures. There are, when we think about those bad outcomes, there's about a 30% risk of autism. And my guess is that we're actually underestimating that. It's probably higher. And there's a tremendous risk of intellectual disability. It feels like almost all of the patients who don't get resolution of infantile spasms end up with major cognitive challenges like difficulty speaking, difficulty learning, communicating. And many also have consequences that affect other parts of the brain, like parts of the brain that affect control of your arms and legs, your motor system, or balance, or your sensory system, or vision. Kind of everything that your brain does is at risk if you don't satisfactorily control infantile spasms.
Yeah, we definitely have connected, both of us, on Instagram mostly, I guess, to a bunch of moms that we've become very close to. And all of our situations have just ranged from like, this person's doing this, but this person's not doing that. It's definitely not like a
uniform.
It's not a uniform situation.
Yeah, it's heterogeneous. There's
like Maverick did very well physically, but everything else has been a very big struggle. Like, as you know, I guess, what would you say is the biggest hindrance in terms of like getting the word out and also just trying to get more information on like how to raise money and like get these studies funded and stuff?
Just to add to what Amanda, you're saying, when we started getting involved philanthropically, you mentioned the struggles of getting funding for pediatric causes because of age biases of patients who are wealthy, and all the way up to the NIH. And I think that'd be helpful to kind of describe that dynamic, which is why you're looking for new drugs, you're looking for new trials, you're looking for new resources, but it's just tough to come by.
Yeah. So there are a couple big problems that we're up against. So number one is bias against epilepsy. So epilepsy is an incredibly stigmatized disorder. And this is not new. This has historically been the case. And you can kind of imagine why, especially if you imagine centuries ago when our understanding of the brain was much more impoverished. If you saw someone having a seizure, kind of the name seizure makes sense. It looks like someone is being controlled by a higher power, that their behavior, their movements, their convulsion, the sounds they might make during a seizure are being controlled by a higher power. And that is a scary notion. And that's where kind of ideas of witchcraft came in. It was thought that people were possessed by the devil if they were having a seizure. And this kind of causes this reaction where people are afraid of epilepsy and they are biased against people with epilepsy because of just the physical result of epilepsy, what it does, what it looks like. Let me give you an example. So let's say you're at Disneyland or Disney World and somebody has a heart attack. What happens? A whole bunch of people rush to that person's aid. They call 911, they do CPR, and it feels like a great experience where the community is coming to the aid of a patient. When it comes to epilepsy, it's often the opposite. So somebody has a seizure. What happens? People are immediately scared or repulsed by what they see. And instead of rushing to that person's aid, they take a step back. And it's not because they're bad people. It's because they don't understand seizures. They're not familiar with epilepsy. they don't have a loved one with epilepsy. They've maybe seen a seizure or two in their life, or maybe none. And it's a scary experience, and they're trying to protect themselves or protect their family members, so they're keeping their distance. The same thing happens when we think about our willingness. It's one thing to not help someone physically when they're in need, but the same thing happens with funding. When you think about the causes that you want to support philanthropically, you support those causes that you know about and care about and that have personally affected you. And in the case of epilepsy, people with epilepsy, especially severe forms of epilepsy, are kind of excluded from the rest of society. So what happens if you're a kid with really bad seizures? Well, good chance you don't go to a regular daycare. Good chance you don't end up in a regular classroom. You're probably sequestered in a classroom for severe special education needs. So as a normal child, you're not getting exposed to people who are continuing to have active seizures. You're not seeing seizures. You're not seeing that it can happen in people who are otherwise okay and not possessed by the devil or what have you. And that is trouble. That is a big problem because you need to see these things. When we think about other disorders that that get a lot of philanthropic support or get government support from organizations like the National Institutes and others, it tends to be disorders that affect adults. And it tends to be things that aren't epilepsy. So we see even for neurologic disorders that support for study and prevention of dementia is much better funded than epilepsy. And we can argue all day about which disorder needs it, and the reality is that both need it. And there are a million disorders under the sun that need more study and more funding there. But epilepsy is disproportionately underfunded at the NIH and internationally with similar organizations. And pediatric epilepsy is in also dire straits. So not only on the funding spectrum, but also just in clinical care. Now, I don't know what your experience was getting to me, but it is really tough to get into pediatric epilepsy. First of all, there are many states that don't have a pediatric epilepsy specialist. So you can already get a sense of the challenge for many people.
I think you mentioned, not to interrupt you, that there's only one pediatric epilepsy doctor in the state of Nevada.
That might be old data. I think there's now two, but still, we need like 100 is the issue.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that recruitment. That recruitment is terrible. Let me tell you why. Let's say you're a medical student at UCLA. So I practice at UCLA. I'm on the faculty of the UCLA School of Medicine. And that student is bright-eyed and enthusiastic and curious and has the potential to do great things in the field. I say, hey, I'm studying a great disease. The brain is super interesting. This is a very rewarding career. I need you to sign up to spend 7 years after you finish medical school to do the training to deliver the care we give. And I need you to just pay the interest on your loans. And I need you to take a pay cut, because if you look at the pay for people who do 7 years of training after medical school, everybody else makes a heck of a lot more money. So I need to tell these people, you gotta take a pay cut. It's gonna take you forever to get your first job. You're gonna be in debt forever. I'm still paying off my med school loan, and I'm not gonna tell you how old I am, but you can see from my hairline, I'm no spring chicken. And I say that joking, but it is tough. Our problem is we don't have enough people just to deliver care for the patients that we see. We need people who can both deliver care and conduct clinical trials or do basic research to better understand this disease. And they need to take a pay cut. So how do you recruit those people? I'll tell you how. You can recruit people who are personally touched by epilepsy. That is by far the prerequisite to go down this path. Now, there are a few of us who don't have those sorts of connections and prior experiences, but the majority do.
So what was your motivation? I've never asked you this, even though we've known you for 4.5 years now.
So it wasn't exactly straightforward, but I'll kind of outline it. So when I was in kindergarten, I had a friend. So it was the daughter of my mom's best friend, who was like a all-star kindergartner or first grader, whatever that means. But she unfortunately got into a pretty bad car accident and had a brain injury. And she suffered as a result of that brain injury, but she also got epilepsy. So she was having lots of seizures. And I saw those seizures at school. It made a big impact. And I had that exact reaction that I just described, where it was not something where I came to her aid. It was something that scared me. And I was not leaning forward or leaning in to help. I was taking a step back. And she was stigmatized by all of her peers who, like me, didn't know anything about epilepsy or seizures and really suffered as a result. Her seizures are still not under control. And I think at least subconsciously that made a pretty big impact on me. Then I went through school and I liked brain science. I liked neuroscience. And I think her experience really sat with me, though. It stayed there. And when I went to medical school, I thought I wanted to be a neurologist. And then I saw pediatrics and pediatric neurology, and I saw kids with seizures. And then I met infantile spasms, which is a pretty darn scary and compelling disorder. I saw that it was one of the toughest to treat and that it was extremely high stakes. And it felt like a good fit. I saw that it's pretty amazing when you can cure somebody with infantile spasms, and it's pretty terrible when you can't. And I think that dichotomy is compelling. It kind of keeps me going. It matters and it's impactful.
I know that we can cut this out too later if it's weird. But I believe I saw, I think we talked about it before too, that you already were well into this field, but then you actually had your child have seizures at one point, not infantile spasms, but you did have a personal connection later on, oddly.
Yeah, that had nothing to do with going into epilepsy. I was among, it seems like a pretty big coincidence, but I became a pediatric epilepsy specialist, and then suddenly my own son had some seizures. And what's kind of a struggle is they're kind of unsolved. So he's luckily seizure-free, but don't exactly know why. And it's, you'd think going through what I've gone through just professionally and in training that I'd get exposure to patients and parents and kind of know everything about epilepsy. But when it's your kid, it's different.
Yeah.
And it's extra scary. And there are all sorts of questions that swirl in your mind, and they don't stop swirling ever. You keep wondering, what is the consequence of seizures? Could we have done something different? Are seizures going to come back? That's the unfortunate nightmare that you might feel good about being several years seizure-free. But that risk is enduring, and it keeps you up at night, literally.
Yeah, we've had, just back to Mav, we had a good 8-month bout, and we were on top of the world. And then, as you know, they came back for 5 months, and now we're back on a good track.
Let's say some positivity. Mav has been seizure-free, knock on wood,
since March. Yeah.
And we were on the verge of this fort surgery that Dr. Hussain described. And Maverick magically started responding to medications that now has given clean brain waves for about 8 months now.
No longer now. Yeah.
Seizure-free, knock on wood again. But, he's still got a lot of work to do. He's got a massive team that works with him. Mm-hmm. Just to give context, he's got 15 people that are specialists in pediatric developmental and different areas: physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, pediatric developmental doctors, vision doctors that all work with him. So to talk about the severity of, how this disease can affect people, we're lucky enough to be able to provide the resources to give them the best shot to keep developing, but it's a struggle. So as we discussed that there's so many barriers to getting better treatments, can you walk through the cost of drug trials and how hard it is to get new therapies for this disorder that everyone thinks is rare, but still affects 2,500 kids a year?
Sure. Yeah. And it is incredibly frustrating because we have lots of candidate therapies, new drugs, or even existing drugs on the shelf that we think have the potential to be incredibly effective and valuable in the treatment of infantile spasms. But we can't do the studies. And I say can't because they are very expensive. So this disorder, we talked about EEG, or brainwave analysis, as a way to characterize the disorder and to determine if it's present or absent, or determine if a patient has responded to therapy. It's super expensive. Requires admission to the hospital, requires a lot of sophisticated interpretation. And when you add that up across several hundred patients in a definitive clinical trial, you end up with costs that are in the tens of millions of dollars. So any candidate drug, if you want to do a definitive study to know if it works or not, you have to be willing to foot that $10 to $40 million bill. And that includes not only that technology and admission to the hospital, but also standard therapies. So whenever you do a clinical trial, you're typically testing two groups. You essentially flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, the patient gets standard therapy, things like prednisolone, ACTH, and vigabatrin, which we said were expensive. And you get those drugs plus your drug of interest that you're trying to test. Or if the coin flip comes up tails, you just take those standard therapies and a placebo. And those standard therapies, again, are very expensive. And if you add up those costs across several hundred patients, you're getting a huge bill. So there is a big financial barrier to this. And that's a big problem for the National Institutes of Health. They say, oh my gosh, yes, you've got a terrible disease. We care about you, but we just don't have $20 or $40 million in the budget this year. Call us back next year and we'll consider your grant request again. That's what's been happening. So, what's the solution there? Well, the solution is that you or one of your viewers will give us $20 or $40 million and we will test that first drug. And if it doesn't work, we'll go on to the second drug and we'll keep going until we cure infantile spasms. But the other approach, which I think is more reasonable, has been to try to de-financially risk this. And by that I mean, well, how can we make these trials cheaper? And what I have been envisioning is that we refine the use of EEG, or this brainwave recording. And that's what we're doing at UCLA and with our academic partners. We are essentially using computers and artificial intelligence to improve the way that we evaluate EEG, or brainwaves, and kind of look at it with better resolution, so to speak, so that we are focusing in on those patterns, those abnormal patterns that are most specific to infantile spasms and that are most related to ongoing risk of other bad downstream events, like other epilepsy, autism, intellectual disability. We want to know who is more or less likely to respond to any particular therapy, and we want to know better like the severity of disease. Because when we talk about infantile spasms right now, it's very dichotomous. We say your drug or your therapy worked or it didn't work, but we aren't very good at grading whether it helped a bit. And if we can be very detailed and quantitative about how much a therapy is working, we can decrease the number of patients that we need in these definitive clinical trials. And like I said before, we're talking about 200 or 300 patients for these definitive trials right now. If we can shrink that to 100 patients, then we would be dividing the cost of those clinical trials, into a fraction. And I think that's what the NIH or funders or pharmaceutical partners need to see. They need to feel like this is not such a big gamble, because they may care about us. They may care about the disease, and they may see a potential payday at the end of the road. If you're a pharmaceutical company and you develop a new successful drug for infantile spasms, you can reasonably charge a lot of money for that therapy because you are potentially avoiding a lot of long-term expensive downstream events, like needing full care for your whole life. We talked about that being approximately $6 or $7 million per patient. If you come up with a new drug that works fantastic, I have no problem with you as a pharmaceutical company charging $500,000 for that drug if it works.
Or you avoid the expensive brain surgery too.
Yeah. These hospitalizations. It's an incredible cost here, and I think we have to look at those. We have to look at those costs and consequences with clear eyes, and we have to think carefully and reasonably about how much we're willing to invest in this research and how much cost we're willing to tolerate as a society or as an insurance company for the costs of new effective therapies. And that is not happening in the way that it needs to happen.
So if you were to approximate how much hospital bills that have been burdened by insurance / our copays, separate from all the pediatric developmental stuff we're doing outside of UCLA, how much do you think Maverick would have cost by now?
I know a lot
3
about
brain
medicine, but
surgeries.
I'm not good at knowing those costs. But I will tell you, I'm sure it's into the 7-figure range.
Right.
No
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've seen the bills minus the insurance, taking it out. It's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
my
and
point.
it's confusing. Yeah, it's very good because you get there's like a cost that the hospital charges, but there's a negotiated cost that insurance pays.
And there's also a lot of pushback from insurance, and then you've had to reach out to them multiple times to even get a medicine approved.
Yeah,
So,
sure. Anytime
it happens all
anytime
the
you
time.
propose an expensive therapy or medicine, it's automatically
It's
denied.
always a pushback.
And that's what insurers need to do to keep costs down. I understand why they do it. It's frustrating, but that is unfortunately our reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think we should end on UCLA, pediatric epilepsy at UCLA, and all the great things you guys are doing. I think we've gotten pretty involved with the hospital at this point, and we're big fans of all the work you guys are doing and how cutting edge, and just take a moment to brag.
Yeah, well, we can pat ourselves on the back for about 15 seconds, and then we need to get back to work because we're nowhere close to where we need to be to call this success. So we certainly appreciate your efforts to build awareness of epilepsy and infantile spasms, and to help support desperately needed research. And on our end, our team at UCLA is ecstatic that we have some of that support, and we want to keep going with it. And hopefully we have this conversation again in a year or 10 years and really celebrate some meaningful victories. We're making good, solid progress, but it is just nowhere near enough.
Yeah, absolutely. We completely agree.
Yeah,
It's very deep to our hearts. Anand just joined the pediatric hospital board, so he's going to start bugging them a little bit more.
Yeah, what help do you need?
Cash. I wish it wasn't that simple, but frankly, it's our efforts are just severely underfunded.
Yeah,
and that's what we need. We need an infusion of cash from the National Institutes of Health and others, and that's what needs to happen. And along the way, we gotta get better study designs going, and that's what we're trying to do.
I believe the UCLA Children's Mattel Board is going to listen to this podcast, from what I've been told. So hopefully they hear you out.
I hope so. All
right. Well, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. I know you're extremely busy and in demand globally for this condition. So thank you so much.
Really quickly, you see patients like across the world, right? Like,
yeah, unfortunately, all over the world.
Or they fly in.
All of the above.
Yeah. He's kind of the guy, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, we're going to do that in the intro. Don't worry.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so
Hussain.
much. Really appreciate it.
We're obviously going to be in touch.